So basically, I kind of, I felt like the schools breaking up and having to kind of, or everyone having to suddenly work from home was all very sudden, and there wasn't much of a build up to it. It was kind of like pretty quick, as like, right, next day you're not coming in. And I kind of thought, oh, what can we do to kind of support these students that are suddenly, sent to fend for themselves, even though there's a great support network of tutors who are also having to suddenly adapt. So I know Max is in that boat of like having to suddenly take all teaching kind of online, and it's not a kind of easy thing to do. And I kind of was thinking, well, what can I do? And I offered tutorials on Skype to students, but I realized that was actually, for me, felt fairly problematic, because I felt like I was commenting on students' work and without necessarily like a background or knowing their tutors or things like that, and I didn't want to be contradicting things that, say, their tutors were saying to them or things like that. So I thought there must be another way to kind of create a community in a time when kind of everyone is now stuck on their own like dinner table or in their bedroom at home or however they're working. So I thought these could be not necessarily about talking about certain projects, but more as a kind of general discussion just about kind of how to approach work in this new kind of way, or just offering support, or just even talking about, what we're doing or what you're doing, or was more of a support thing. I think in the future, if this works, we might do some that are slightly more themed. So some that are more based on, say, essay writing or dissertation writing, and I've got a few people lined up to do those, or some that are maybe more based on kind of structures and kind of technology and questions around that. But yeah, we'll see how it goes. And also, like, I would love your feedback of what you think kind of works or doesn't work, or how it could kind of work better. I'm just kind of trying to work it out as we go along. So for anyone who's kind of just joined us, the plan is that Piers and Max and Lee will all kind of introduce themselves, and we will kind of lead this as a bit like a kind of panel, almost, we'll start it as a kind of like panel discussion slightly, and then if you guys kind of want to ask questions or want to kind of chip in, if you click on a thing that says raise hand, I think it's near participants somewhere, or if you type in the chat, then I'll field questions in various ways. There's supposed to be about 80 people coming onto this. I don't know whether everyone actually will, but if they do, it might get a bit busy and we might have to work out how to do this, but we're all learning. So Max, do you want to introduce yourself and say a bit about what you've been doing, what you do normally?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Max Dewdney. I'm an architect and also an academic. So I work at the Bartlett School of Architecture. I'm co-director of Year 1 and teach a postgraduate unit 15 there as well. I do that for around 2 days a week, and the rest of the time I have a studio in Dalston in East London, and I work on a range of projects from education to community to infill housing, and I spend my time between both giving tutorials, designing, doing work on site, and yeah, trying to balance that. I have a family, so I have 2 children. I live in Walthamstow in East London, and yeah, that's kind of a small introduction to me.
Great, thanks. How about Piers? Do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'm an architect. I have a practice called Invisible Studio. In terms of my teaching background, I most recently helped set up the Design and Make program at the AA, where students spend 16 months designing and constructing a building and then writing a thesis about their experiences. I have also run a unit at Cambridge for a long time and ran the 3rd year previously at the University of Bath. I'm just finished I'm finishing my PhD thesis, which looks at, in a way, the social consequences of making in an architectural context, and with others also set up this thing that Laura and Lee are involved with, which is the Studio in the Woods that happens every year. And that's probably enough.
Great, thanks. And Lee, next up.
Yeah, my name is Lee Ivett. I'm an architect designer. I have a practice called Baxendale Studio, which kind of is wherever I happen to be at any given time, I suppose. I live in Scotland, currently in a place called Gourock on the west coast of Scotland, but I teach in my hometown of Preston at the Grenfell Baines Institute of Architecture. I'm the undergraduate program leader there, so I'm kind of very interested in architectural education from kind of year 1 to year 3, and the kind of transition from education into practice at that point as well. And my own practice has been focused on participatory making in very challenging urban situations usually. So my work is quite often self-built. It involves quite agile modes of funding and agile modes of production. And I suppose if there's anything I can kind of offer people today who are kind of looking at those kind of issues within community context and participatory context, that's something I'd probably have a particular bit of expertise to offer.
Great. I'd just like to personally say a huge thanks to you three for coming on board and doing this at a kind of fairly short notice and without really knowing what you were letting yourselves in for. So yeah.
The fun of it.
Yeah, so good. I mean, what else? I don't want to be working.
Yeah. So for anyone else that's just joined us, the plan is that we will take questions from everyone, and yeah, you can all add into the discussion. There's a kind of button in the participants bit that allows you to raise your hand if you want to do that, if you've got something to say, and I'll then field these kind of questions. Or if you want to write something in the chat, you can do it that way as well, and I'll kind of keep an eye on what's going on. I guess maybe I'll kick things off with just asking kind of Lee and Piers and Max how you found the kind of transition to now teaching kind of online and working kind of more remotely. I know, Piers, you're kind of fairly used to working on your own in your little studio. Yeah. It's probably not a massive change for you, but kind of how have things changed, and like how have you been adapting to this change?
Sure. Shall I go first then? I mean, I think that I wanted to work like this because I hated the distinction between the work bits of my life and the non-work bits. And for me, it felt so weird and artificial to leave somewhere in the morning to go somewhere else for a set period of time and then come back at a relatively set period of time every day. And, you know, for me, I didn't work like that. I didn't live like that. I wanted to be able to integrate my life and practice. And in a way, I knew then, I mean, this is kind of 10 years ago, that I needed to be able to work virtually and remotely. And if I'm honest, it took quite a long time to get that to work. And because practice is really a dialogue and a conversation. And I think that the conversation that we have face to face with a pen and overhearing things, the sort of chance bits that happen within practice are, for me, the lifeblood of practice. You know, the sort of incidental things that you get just by being in the same space as someone. So I think I wanted not to isolate myself. And I think, you know, you've been here, and I think what's interesting about how I work now is that there are a lot of people around. Charlie Brentnell's around, Tara, who works with me, is around. There's a lot of people all around all the time in a kind of wider community. And that network is really, really important. But fundamentally, I think that the challenges are how to, for all of us now in this new world, is how do we, you know, really recreate the sort of incidental, the chance encounter, not the formal teaching. Formal teaching is possible in theory by these kind of FaceTime environments. But the sort of, when you're in uni, the kind of, or in a studio, in a practice, or in a meeting, the sort of things that you half hear, the things that you oversee, the drawings, the models, there's sort of bits of inspiration that happen in a creative context, I think are super important. And in a way, are perhaps more important than the face-to-face tutorials. I mean, it's like my friend Alf, whose child wasn't doing very well at school. He said to his father, who was a teacher, oh, Arthur's not doing very well at school. He's really struggling with his work. And his dad said, well, that's not really the point of going to school, is it? And it's all the other stuff that we dream up alongside our work that I think is really important that we find ways to maintain. I haven't quite answered your question, but I've kind of opened, the conversation, I guess, with that.
Yeah, no, I think it's really useful. I think that is one of the things that kind of is now missing, is that is those studio interactions and the kind of chat moments of, just past someone's desk and seeing something or having a chat. So Lee, do you want to kind of expand on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think I've probably come in at it from the opposite position of Piers in a way, because I've recently been in a kind of extreme mode of detachment from home and work, where I would travel down to Preston, usually at R5 on a Tuesday morning, live in Preston during the week, teaching and working, and then be back in home, by about 9 o'clock on Friday evening. And to a certain degree, over the last 15 months, I'd kind of got used to and found a value in that kind of detachment, where I kind of had a teaching life down in Preston, and then I kind of had a home life to kind of escape back in Scotland. And so now I've been forced into a rapid realignment of what that kind of routine is. And now my relationship with my students is happening from my house. At the same time as my partner, who is also an architect, is on a slight 1 meter higher level than me at the moment, working on some other architecture projects, and we can choose to pretend that we're both in the same house at the same time or not, or whatever. And so I've gone from kind of a situation of quite, extreme detachment between those two ways of living, to then those two now being kind of absolutely inherently kind of linked. And I'm kind of enjoying it loads is what, at the moment. And I kind of, I suppose I don't feel, in some ways, like with the first tutorials and sessions that I've been doing with my students have been the best attended of all year. It's a kind of, all of a sudden there's less places to hide in a way, for my students. Just keep annoying them via the computer saying, I want to speak to you. They can't say, a lot of the excuses for not turning up have now disappeared, because there's nothing else for them to do other than
not there.
Gotta try and get on with being creative, and trying to engage in this kind of new world. But I definitely concur that the joy of a just chance encounter, just kind of something appearing out of nothing, is something that it'd be good to think about, how you do continue to create those opportunities in this kind of detached digital scenario.
Max, do you want to tell us a little bit about kind of how your teaching's changed now at the Bartlett? I know you're doing kind of first year and you do postgrad as well, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I talk about the first year, I think it's incredibly, it's the first interaction that people have had with architecture, and it needs to be incredibly physical. I think it's quite a difficult thing. I think perhaps for postgraduates or later in the year where they have advanced things slightly more, there's a continuity, you could say, or there's, they're finishing off a project. For our first years, it's the first encounter that they are having with designing their first building. So that's quite a sort of precious moment. And to do that remotely is not easy, I think, to say the least. I mean, the first sort of week, we've actually just generally been monitoring and trying to actually make sure that all the students are safe. They've gone off, we have around 60% home students, 30% overseas, 10% European. And so a lot of students are still in quarantine. A lot of students, are unwell. So there's a huge variety and a range of, you know, from around the globe, the impact. I mean, I was speaking today, for example, to two students who are in Singapore. They're both quarantined in their room with electronic tags on their arm. And, you know, they say that 70% of the sort of, you know, cases of COVID are coming from the UK into Singapore. So there's a very kind of freshness to this. And I think partly the international nature of a lot of the students brings it a little bit to the forefront. So there's kind of a major recalibration. And I think that there have been some positives out of it, but I completely hear what Piers was saying immediately, that I'm kind of, over the last 2 days, I have a digital headache. So there's a sort of echo in my head, you know, which is partly because we're not used to spend so much time speaking on it. I'm obviously going to have to get some headphones, but I think that there is, there's a sort of a recalibration. And what I've been trying to reflect upon is that I think we have an opportunity now to slow down. And I think we should all try to slow down, because I think the idea that we can continue on the same normal level that we have been continuing, I think we'll miss opportunities, you know. So I think if we start to think about what other skills can we develop, all of us, that are going to be for resilience, and also going to be for sort of the long term. So I think it's quite a nice opportunity for students to try to think about different ways and different things that they can look at outside of, you know, oh, I've got to get my project finished, I've got a certain amount of time, a certain deadline. So, you know, in that sense, the calibration for me and students and colleagues is multifaceted. And I mean, for my own practice, for my own work, you know, on one level, you know, technology is a great savior for all of us, because we all work, you know, remotely anyway. So there's been more limited disruptions from that aspect of it. And I'd say much more from the teaching and the engagement.
Yeah, great. I think it does signal a time when kind of resilience is going to become a kind of the next key thing in architecture projects from students. I've had a few conversations about that this week. I wanted to kind of open it up. Does anyone else want to kind of chip in with your thoughts, or kind of any comments that you have about how you're feeling as students, and kind of anything on that?
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy.
Or ask us about your project, or anything you like. Anything that you would get at uni, typically. Why are you joining? Tell us why you've accepted Laura's invitation to come to this forum.
Hi.
Robin Simpson, you want to? Yeah.
We've started some sort of conversations around doing something like this from the CAS undergrads. We've actually been finding that the kind of feedback that we're getting through these online tutorials and stuff has actually been slightly more useful than sometimes like face-to-face, where there's sort of distractions in the studio and it's sort of a little bit more direct. And also there's this sort of wonderful facility that you can share information and files and images sort of more quickly than perhaps having them on a table, in terms of precedent and like bringing a project about, you know. I think it's kind of proving to be quite useful. I'm just trying to find, I've made a brief for our for what we're proposing. I think sorry, I should have it in front of me, but I've stupidly put it away. So yeah, we think that it's quite a useful way of perhaps bringing various schools together. I don't know how that works in terms of like the sovereignty of schools, but having perhaps like a sort of Q&A, like the Q&A section of a lecture, but that's the totality of it. So having, say, someone as the chair for the conversation, who might be sort of an industry expert on a particular thing, which is the theme of that particular talk, and they operate as the kind of chairperson, so they have something to say about that topic, but then it kind of, in this format, you know, people can come straight in with questions, and I mean, I think that's pretty much as far as we've got with it. It's quite a new idea for us, but yeah, it just seems like it has the opportunity to be a far more inclusive and open space for people to talk. So.
I think what I found with setting this up was that the actual kind of like cross section of who signed up was really broad, and so I thought actually this could be a really interesting vehicle for getting schools which would often normally be quite siloed and wouldn't talk across schools to actually communicate together and have students who could kind of share knowledge or even share kind of thoughts of how they were feeling across a kind of wider platform. So we've had there's a lot of UK schools signed up to this, but there's also kind of schools in Europe as well and other people. So I found that really interesting, that maybe, I don't know if a bit further down the line, once you're not so quite so shy, someone might want to talk about, you know, that or what that means as a student for you.
I think the sovereignty of a school is a really dangerous thing. I mean, I think one of the reasons I was most attracted to Robert Marl's Global Free Unit was that the sense that the student is an agent before they come to uni, and they travel through uni as an agent, and when they leave, it isn't then that they start. They're already an autonomous, free-thinking architectural agent before they even go to uni. And in a way, I find institutions really dangerous. I've never really being able to exist in an institution, and the sort of the school, the thinking of the school, the kind of dogma of the school, the orthodoxy of the school can be great, but it can also be really kind of stifling and in some ways kind of infantilizing, I feel. And one of the things I feel excited about is that, you know, as our world is shutting down, the last 3 years have been dominated by all of our world shutting down in whatever way. And this sense that actually we need to fight against that, I think, is a really important one, and to find ways to build relationships through understandings with others, not because of a kind of abstract institution of a kind of boundary, a territory, a county, a country, and it's, you know, whatever it is, I think.
Yeah, Robin, you wanted to respond to that?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of something that I've been feeling quite keenly. I've gone straight into second year on an undergrad at the CAS, and I think there's an inherent issue with the unit system, in as much as there's a set sort of focus for your year, and it kind of relatively limits the input from, you know, your life before the unit, and I mean, whilst you can try and sort of shoehorn your interest into what that's about, I think this has sort of potential to be again more inclusive of kind of people's specialisms and interests outside of the unit. So I don't know if anyone can respond to that.
Well,
I mean,
go on, Max.
I think that I think really the greatest opportunity of being a student and having the time is to develop your own methods of working. And I think that this opportunity is probably, you know, greater to say, well, actually, what are the things I'm interested in? How do I want to work? How can I communicate and build various kind of networks and lines of research myself? And I think that most certainly in my teaching approach, I've always, you know, really encouraged students to be able to just define for themselves what their practice is, because ultimately architecture and design is a very long game. You know, it's going to take years and years and years. And I think this idea of time and us understanding that things actually take a longer amount of time is quite a good opportunity for students to build up that sense of actually, you know, how will I be able to answer my own questions? How will I be able to have, you know, a sense of understanding about, am I going the right direction or not? And of course, we all need to check in and cross-reference, and having different forums to be able to check with people is fantastic. But I think this idea of building a resilience, I think that can help everyone.
And what kind of advice would you give to students now in developing that? Like, you know, now there's not the kind of four walls of a classroom and you're constantly kind of being told by your unit tutors, kind of like you've constantly got that kind of support. How would you tell students to kind of go about working now that they're kind of at home?
And I think the first thing is that there's an interesting design project, even just in considering that, you know, so all of a sudden the kind of environment that you want, pretty much now you've potentially got, you know, quite a lot of agency, but not many resources through which to kind of create an environment to work in. And that's quite interesting. So, you know, even the process that a lot of people are now going through to turn, you know, a bedroom, a kitchen, a table, a hall, a stair, or whatever into something that you can kind of work within is quite interesting. I mean, people, you know, you can still order things can still get delivered to you. I would be saying that all my students should just order big rolls of paper, put it all over whatever wall in whatever room they're in, and just draw on it constantly, you know. I also saw a great little kind of series of posts by an architect I know in Glasgow on Instagram, where he used his empty Crunchy Nut cornflakes box to make a really beautiful model of a project his practice is working on. And so even like thinking about, you know, even as a student, what it is that you're actually using and consuming anyway in this existence, and then reusing that in a creative way in your own projects is worth looking at. I mean, I'd be delighted, you know, if my students made their models out of like old coasters, or, you know, all of the, you know, whoever's bought all the toilet roll have probably got loads of toilet roll tubes they can make things out of now as well. So I think that it's a good opportunity to really, really, really think kind of creatively and critically and imaginatively about what production means, and what the output of that production is visually as well, you know, and take that as your first design challenge, you know, alongside whatever it is you're doing with your projects as well, and the work that you've been asked to do.
Yeah,
I think in a way that's really interesting, because I would agree, and I think that the danger of architectural education, in my experience, is that it is conceived of as a solitary act, although we do it in these communal spaces and communal places. The way that we are kind of indoctrinated at architecture school is that we conceive of this thing by ourselves, and we produce this thing by ourselves. And the danger of this environment is that we retreat more and more into that scenario where we feel we have to invent this thing by ourselves and develop a narrative for it on our own that we present back to our tutor. But as Lee said, I think that the kind of processes by which we conceive of that allow us to make architecture is a really important kind of challenge for us. How do we put together scenarios within which we can work when we're so isolated? How do we begin to invent ways of working, ways of conceiving of places and spaces and buildings and architectural ideas when we are like, I mean, for me, that's the most important thing of all. To carry on as if nothing has changed is a missed opportunity to really understand that we can think of completely different ways of doing architecture that go way beyond anything that was possible in a studio context, I think. But to try and do what we were doing in studio, but even in a little bit more isolated way, feels the wrong approach.
Yeah, definitely. Andre, you've got your hand up. What do you want to say?
Linked to what we've just been talking about, and Lee's research into pedagogy to practice, one thing that they both share is a working hours culture of extreme working hours. I wondered if this is an opportunity for us to all take a deep look at that and consider what's a healthy practice in terms of how many hours we put in or how efficient we are with how we work. I wondered if you guys had any thoughts on that, and whether things will change, or if it's just a short-term blip, if things will just go back to exactly how they were.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the kind of working culture is always one that I've struggled with, and struggled with the right narrative at the right time in terms of what I communicate to my students as well. Because I know that whether I like it or not, when I was at university, I definitely tricked myself into thinking I was at the most productive between 8 in the evening and 4 in the morning. And, you know, would quite happily, you know, sketch away in a little sketchbook for 6 weeks and then go in the night before a crit and actually really quite get off on just smashing it in the, you know, in like 8 hours solid on Pro Plus. But actually then you kind of mature and you grow older and you realize that's kind of, you know, it's maybe not the best way. And maybe, you know, if I'd kind of acted in a different way, I might have been more productive, or I might have kind of got on better than than that approach. But then I definitely took that approach into working for myself for like 10, 12 years, and, you know, was the worst employer I could ever work for. You know, it was just me, unfortunately, that was the you know, I was both working for a kind of pretty drastic version of myself, but also being that person at the same time. And I think through that and the impact that's had, I've become much more attuned to talking to my students about getting that balance right, but also trying to get the students to also be honest with themselves in whether that, if that productivity does happen out with the normal working hours, then kind of fine, but you need to find that balance in other ways. And I suppose this situation maybe does provide an opportunity for greater flexibility in terms of how we individually create that balance, because maybe not everyone can fit into a neat and tidy 9 till 5 existence, and maybe being kind of, you know, pigeonholed, you know, cocooned and compressed into such kind of strict timetabling based on, you know, a kind of very traditional, you know, capitalist mode of production that is about when it gets light and when it goes dark. Fallacy all along. So I think that trying to find, you know, and discuss flexible ways of being productive, but not in a way that becomes unbalanced, and also reconsidering what it means to kind of have a kind of balanced life in terms of, you know, work, study, leisure, and the rest of it is quite important at this time.
Be curious to hear Piers' views on it, because you seem to have knitted your work into the fabric of your life outside of work. So
yeah, I mean, rather embarrassingly, I've never done an all-nighter. I mean, so when I started architecture school 30 years ago, I had a child and I couldn't, I had to juggle, you know, I was a kind of primary carer. My then partner worked kind of very long hours. So I always had to juggle childcare, you know, and now my youngest child is only 9, we have 4 children, and the youngest is but I think critically I felt that the simple answer to the question is I feel I'm always working, which is a really bad thing. But at the same time, I would argue that I'm always living. And there is no distinction between my work and life, and very few boundaries. And I'm unable to separate. And I think, you know, it feels really important to me that I can walk away from a work thing and not feel guilty that I'm doing something that's a home thing, and vice versa. And for me, I've ended up with a much more natural way of working, where I don't mind doing emails at 9 o'clock at night, because it might be that at 11 o'clock the next morning, I'm doing something that is non-supposed work related. I refuse to draw the distinctions between what is work and what is life, you know, and in a way, even professionally, I won't make those distinctions with clients and things. You know, I'm kind of upfront about boundaries or lack of them. And actually, in a way, I think it's a call for all of us to be treated as kind of grown-ups, where we define our own way of working. How is it that we can work? How is it that we want to work? And if we're clear about how we want to work, people respond to it. You know, I used to feel really guilty and ashamed about having to say I need to work like this, you know, but actually, you know, really people respond to it. And so I think find our own rhythms is the really important thing. If you want to do an all-nighter and it's on your terms and it's how you're productive and where you're productive, I think it's not a bad thing. For me, I've never been productive, you know, in the middle of the night or at 4 in the morning. So I think really the boundaries between life and work are kind of completely abstract things, and they kind of don't exist. We create them, and if we're going to create them, we must create them on our own terms.
I mean, I would agree with both what Lee and Piers have said about that. I mean, I think that you need to somehow be able to define your own. Different people work better at different times of the day, and I think that there's also a case that if you can define what your relationship to work is and how that makes you happy in yourself, then that's something that, you know, each individual needs to sort of address. There is obviously wider issues within the industry about kind of exploitation of hours and, you know, overworking people and not paying them. And I think those type of things are part of a much larger system. I think that those are issues that we can't necessarily sort of address right now. But I think that what this situation, I think, has most certainly made me think about, and I'm sure others, is actually what really does matter. What really does matter to you? Because I think once you strip away a lot of the noise, a lot of the background, the idea of what production is, the idea of what a notion of efficiency is, all these things can come into question. So I think that, you know, to some degree, the opportunity here, and picking up on the question about, you know, the different working environments. And I mean, I've been thinking a lot about facades, for example, and how, you know, the interaction out of the window, you know, because you're contained now in the house. I mean, in Italy, we see people singing to each other in the streets. In Geneva, at 9 o'clock, they're clapping all of the NHS staff. So I think actually the opportunity to explore what physically your environment is, because I think a lot of student projects can become, you know, grand narratives, very complicated, and actually they don't really address what something, you know, is to live in. What is a space? What is light? What is material? You know, what's a sense of how I'm going to interact with another person? You know, some of the kind of fundamentals of, you know, dwelling and being and architecture. I think, you know, actually being in a room, having to occupy a room with a different person. Just before we started, I was speaking to Laura about, you know, various people now, you know, families living together in houses, but one's in another room, but they can't physically talk to each other because someone's in isolation. So they're talking through the phone. So I think actually it allows us a good opportunity to re-examine some of these, you know, fundamental basics of what architecture and space are and how they can improve all of our lives. And I think, you know, that's what I think architecture schools can perhaps reconnect with at this point in time.
Yeah, I think I would agree. It gives you a kind of I think it gives a different kind of fundamental understanding of space and of interaction. I've definitely felt that here at the moment. Like, I've noticed being in a space for a much longer period of time and being really confined to that space, I've noticed kind of different things.
I think also, I mean, just to add to that, I think, you know, what Max is also saying, or I'm kind of reading into what Max is saying, and I kind of believe very strongly, is that designing artifacts is really interesting. And I think in some ways we pretend that it isn't, but buildings are really interesting. But at the same time, I think developing ways of designing buildings is actually fairly easy. We pick it up through osmosis in the world. And it's developing all of the other stuff that sits around that to make buildings enduringly interesting is a kind of thing that we don't really talk about enough as architects. You know, all of the other stuff, the kind of the day-to-day, making life an architectural experience and actually living our life as an architect, I think is a really important thing. And I think that, you know, my friend Alf, who I just referred to, who's a mathematician, you know, the first thing that he talks to his students about is, you know, how is it that we are a mathematician in the world? How do we see this place as a kind of mathematician? And I think seeing the world through an architectural lens is so much more than just designing buildings, however interesting designing buildings is.
Yeah, definitely. We've had a question come in from Rodrigo. I'm just going to kind of read this out. So he says, I've been doing my PhD for the last 4.5 years as a foreigner in Portugal, and I have to agree with Piers on the dangers of formal groupings as schools. I experienced something quite bad trying to participate actively at my department because I wasn't considered part of that specific group, raised and bred locally. It can be very frustrating and an obstacle to take some steps further. I would like to hear your opinions on what could be done to make a difference facing such sort of situation. Do you want to start, or Lee, you start?
I mean, I think that's an interesting kind of scenario to, you know, found yourself in, where, you know, you're in an institution where there's a sense that not being of that place or of that situation can cause some form of isolation. In the institution that I'm working in, it is also predominantly kind of made up of fairly local people from the northwest of England. And I've kind of been wrestling with this kind of to what extent the architectural school or the university operates as a local civic place of empowerment and capacity building, you know, and to what extent the University of Central Lancashire and the School of Architecture teaching should first and foremost respond to the needs of its geography, its locality, its people, but in a way that is still exceptionally accessible, and also that kind of learning that is generated through a kind of initial focus on, you know, what it is that's immediate to us as people and place, is also something that other people who aren't from that place can also learn from in terms of the methods we apply to that. So I think for kind of, I mean, I'm quite interested to hear more in terms of what Rodrigo's got to say about that experience, because we, I think, are managing to get a balance right, where even though we have quite a lot of local students, our kind of foreign students and those who are coming out with that situation do, on the whole, I think, feel exceptionally welcome. We try and always communicate, you know, the kind of the value of participating in a new environment, a new culture, a new social situation, and work hard to make sure people don't feel excluded, even if what we're looking at, and even if how we sound, and even if how we behave kind of has a certain, you know, kind of flavour to it that comes from being, you know, from the northwest of England or wherever.
Max, do you have any thoughts on that, of you know, students coming to the Bartlett, you know, who might not have done their part one there but have started there in their part two? The Bartlett's got a real kind of quite a strong kind of sense of itself and what it is. How do you feel for students coming?
The Bartlett tends to have quite a lot of students that haven't done their undergraduate there, and I think that's a very healthy thing in the part two. I mean, I personally, I did my part one at the Bartlett, but then I did my part two at the Cooper Union in New York, and then I did sometime I was a Rome scholar and lived in Rome. I think it's very important to, I agree with Piers, I actually, whilst I've been part of institutions for the last 10 years between the Bartlett and the University of Greenwich, I actually hate institutions, and I'm not an institutional person. So I think there is a big danger of any groupings of people that get too large. And any time when people seem to think that it's a particular clique or a cluster, or they tend to think through a large institution, I think actually as things get larger or bigger groups, you actually need to be more inventive and more creative. And so I guess to come to the specific point, I think that it's inevitable, and we can't unfortunately avoid in human, you know, human culture. People do cluster together, and they tend to sort of, you know one another and whatever. That's what kind of, I guess, football teams are. But, you know, as a student, I think all you can do is actually try to reach out of that and build strength in your own work, and believe in your own work, because ultimately, it doesn't really matter what other people, you know, think about that. And I think that's the strongest thing you need to do. If you're doing a PhD, I imagine, you know, that's a huge investment, and you may be coming to the end of that. I mean, I guess, you know, it's unfortunate that people are not, you know, more collegiate and, you know, actually don't realize it doesn't really matter where you're from or what school you're from. I mean, the Bartlett has quite an international community, and I personally think it needs to be much more, you know, reach out much more and be much less insular, you know, not look inwards, actually. I think that opportunities, you know, that may occur now are for us to start to think about how do we reach out and have a presence that's outside of the walls of the institution.
Great. Piers, did you want to add anything?
Sure. I mean, I can't recognize any cultural distinction based on geography. I mean, I simply cannot understand what it means. I mean, I think place is such an abstract notion, you know. I mean, you know, for example, you know, I was in Kate and Jani's review recently for their students, and, you know, their project is based in Morocco, but, you know, Morocco isn't a thing. It doesn't exist. It's a cultural construct. There's a kind of line between it and something else. And, you know, and I'm from nowhere. I went to university overseas and I came back here, and being an outsider was much more stimulating for me than being an insider, because it felt incredibly exotic, that everything was different, everything was strange, everything was new. And it meant that when I came back here, everything was strange and everything was new and everything was exotic. And I felt like an outsider again because I hadn't gone to uni in London in the late 80s where most of my contemporaries have and had. And I think that, you know, I simply, you know, I mean, I've been quite outspoken on Brexit because I simply don't understand it. I simply cannot understand why regional and local identity can in any way be prioritized when I believe that, you know, as an anthropologist I admire wrote that, you know, our place isn't a territory defined with a little line around it. It's the traces we leave in the world that are multiple and intertwined and complex. And you know, I've been reading this morning a text by Donna Haraway, who's a feminist writer, and you know, the simple lesson that I took from this text is that we cannot take binary, simplistic, kind of male-dominated readings of things that are fixed and definite in the world. And my understanding about place and regional and institutions is that they're sort of male conceits. They're not complex, they're not interwoven, they're not sophisticated in their kind of in how we are in the world, which is as a complex individual made up of all sorts of contradictions based on geography, cultural identity, assumed identity, and invention of ourselves. I mean, one of the, you know, biggest sort of conceits about being human is that we can invent our own identity, and that's so interesting. So I think that, you know, I think that the simple answer to the question is that being an outsider where you are is much more stimulating ultimately than ever having been any kind of insider, and I would hang on to that.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think it's better to be an outsider than an insider in an institution. Does anyone else want to ask any questions or kind of raise their hand? Alicia?
Yeah, hello.
Hi.
I've got a question in regards to education again, I guess. So I currently go to Glasgow School of Architecture, which had to close due to the virus. So the situation was that all the assignments that we possibly had got cancelled and we have no submissions further. And because we're in like postgraduate stage, it's still quite an important year. And I was wondering if you've got any kind of advice on how to stay motivated in times when you're not really getting marked and you're kind of got all this freedom to yourself, like whether to carry on with the projects you already have or start a competition, and like how to get that actually working.
Yeah, I mean, I taught at the Mac before I started my current position down in Preston. And so I was quite surprised to kind of hear they'd taken a position to just cancel all the submissions, especially for kind of final year students as well. And I actually had a Skype conversation with a student at the Mac today to kind of help him with his dissertation. And he's taken the position that he's really into what he's writing about in his dissertation. He knows that at some point he's going to probably have to finish a dissertation or hand in a dissertation or have that as something to kind of transfer to another institution or another place. And he's kind of invested in the critical thinking that had inspired him to write about this particular subject. And I've kind of encouraged him to, carry on doing it, keep doing it. And I suppose, you know, the best projects at university from students are the ones where they've stopped asking me, oh, how do I get a good grade? Or what do you think the grade will be? The best projects are the ones where they've stopped worrying about that. They're just like really invested in the kind of idea that they're exploring through design. And so regardless of whether anyone is asking you to submit work or not submit work, you know, if you've got something that, you know, you're really invested in and you want to produce and you want to create and you want to complete, then just do it. Because even if it feels right now that the institution isn't interested in kind of seeing it and looking at it, someone else will be. And, you know, and the more of yourself that is invested in that, actually the more interested someone else is going to be in that at a certain point. And, you know, you're going to still need to be thinking about how you work, how you produce, how you get employed, or how you create your own projects in this environment. Any student at the moment who demonstrates an ability to, you know, improvise, use their initiative, stay productive, stay creative, is going to be a massive asset when we come through the other side of this, you know, to themselves and to the society that we emerge into at the end of all this. I
gave similar advice to a student yesterday who was in a similar position kind of not knowing whether to carry on with doing their projects or doing work. And I just said, like, you're going to need to build up a portfolio at some, you know, at some point, and if you want to carry on, and if you're enjoying your projects, like, just do them, like, use it as a kind of something to like occupy yourself and to fill your time, but only do it if you're enjoying it, and if you're kind of interested in that kind of exploration. And if you're not, then find something else to do, find like another project to do, learn how to draw using a different material you've never used before, or make some models, or kind of make your own project, or do something else, but only do it if you're kind of wanting to do it and enjoying it. Otherwise, like, what's the point of putting something that you don't want to do or don't want to have in your portfolio? Did anyone else want to add to that, Max?
I mean, I would agree that I think it's important, if you're very interested in your project, you should continue it, because you should see that this is outside of, you know, what the mark's going to be or how it's going to be conceived. Actually, it's about you developing a set of ideas that you're interested in, that you might return to. You know, questions might not be answered straight away, but they might be seeds that, you know, start to grow over many years. And whilst you may have a sort of limited resource at the moment, because I know certain students, for example, if they've had a very making-based project and they've been in the workshops a lot, then obviously, you know, the same type of work can't continue. And I don't think we can pretend that it can in this current situation. But I would say that to stay motivated, actually stay engaged, and also to commit to yourself, you've got to realize this is for you, this work, and it's something that will go beyond COVID-19. It will go beyond a term deadline. You know, ultimately it's a set of practices that you're trying to establish at this point, you know, that are then going to lead to other conversations, other connections. And so, I mean, I don't know what your project is, but you could by all means think about it now and reflect upon, you know, now in this situation, how would you look back at that and start to readdress it and think about, you know, what life may it have now, and how can you re-energize that?
I think that's right. I think that, you know, your own autonomous and authentic resilience is much more important than having gone through the hoops of completing something to get a grade. And in some ways, it may be that you do need closure on your project, otherwise it may feel like abandoned work. So I would continue with it for as long as nothing else supersedes it. But I think, you know, the opportunities to think differently about where we are. I mean, as we were talking about at the beginning, I mean, it may be that you're in a space, you're in a flat, you can't go out. And for me, you know, it reminds me when I lived in a tiny flat in London 30 years ago, and in summertime, we had no outside space, and I would get back in the evening and I'd kind of hang out the window to get a little bit of daylight, because I've been inside all day. And actually, you know, there's an architectural project in that. How would I make a space that I can be in, you know, for the next however many months when the weather's going to get better? You know, how can I make that a project? How would I think about it? How would I represent it? How would I change it? How would I build it? You know, that could be super interesting, and documenting it. And then, you know, expanding to see where that takes you, and to be able to see the world through your own kind of autonomous architectural glasses, I think is more interesting ultimately than completing a project because you were on that trajectory and you're no longer on that trajectory. You know, I think our advice earlier was you wouldn't do what you were doing, you know, a month ago, because things are different.
Yeah, that's all super helpful. Thank you so much.
It's all right.
I'm going to try to depict my projects, I guess, and like concentrate on what I'm actually really interested in and push that further, and maybe drop the uninterested things behind that's been done just for the course. See how it goes.
You don't need to. If no one's looking at it, just take that opportunity.
Yeah.
Well, we've also had some more questions come in, so I'm going to read a couple of these. So from Arena, she says, most of graduating part 1s and 2s are planning to apply for jobs this summer. And obviously the situation with the virus will affect this. What would you recommend us to do, especially for those who have never had any professional experience?
Well, I mean, I think that I suppose anyone who was looking to get a job in 2008, when that last recession happened, would be, good people to seek out for, in terms of advice in this situation as well, where all of a sudden, you know, a kind of jobs market, disappeared, you know, like yourself, Laura, so, you know, just disappeared, you know, in an instance. Now, this is even more, I don't know, it's difficult to read what that situation's actually going to be like at the moment, because on one hand, obviously, kind of what we perceive as working in practice is potentially now going to have to change, because that, again, is not going to be necessarily in the form of a corporate institution type form where we all go into a room and we sit at desks and we kind of share physical space. But I do feel that, you know, there's going to be a huge amount of opportunities that also arise out of this situation. And the best thing that anyone at the moment who's going like part 1 or part 2 can do is to try and think about all the problems that this current situation creates, and then think about how to solve them, and to think about each of those issues as a design challenge, and try and think about alternative scenarios that might address that. And I mean, for me, I started a practice when I was still at university. So when I entered my final year of study, I just decided I was kind of interested in a certain avenue of practicing, of producing. And I didn't feel that any office that I could see at that time in Scotland would offer me the job that I wanted to do. And I felt I needed to create it for myself. And that is the kind of attitude and the approach I would maybe take at this point in time as well, is, you know, maybe even the kind of project that Piers was just talking about kind of reimagining the kind of, and Max as well, talking about a facade and what a facade is in a society where actually that as a means of communicating across a street or performing or kind of feeling present or feeling active, you know, all of a sudden the facade might need to be a gym, it might need to be a performance space, it might need to be something to project onto from your house onto another one, so everyone in the street can watch a film together. You know, like there's all of these potential amazing design projects that can be manifest through the situation we find ourselves in. And if you can come up with some of those ideas, and you can publicize those ideas and communicate those ideas and share those ideas, then you might find that all of a sudden you become very employable. And if you're not becoming employable by someone else, you might find that people start asking you to do things. And so I would kind of try and take that route, is start thinking about what it is you want to produce, why you want to produce it, and derive that from a kind of critical analysis of the situation we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I think there's some really good points there. I think, but for me as well, obviously I graduated from my part 1 in 2008 when the recession kind of hit, and I kind of just where I took a job just because it was a job and there was nothing else. And I really regretted that decision afterwards, because I'd kind of got myself stuck in a practice that I didn't want to be at for quite a long time. And it was great to have a job, but the experience that I was getting was not anything like what I wanted to do. So I think, like, as well, is like, don't just take the job, like think about kind of what you want to be doing and where you want to be in the future, and kind of and be very, like, be careful about that as well, and kind of develop your own path rather than just take kind of what's there.
Completely. I mean, I think, you know, getting a job is really boring. I mean, at the most basic level, to answer your question about what do you do, I mean, you work on your terms and tell people what you have to offer. I mean, we are working with someone in Greece who works for us. He also works for Gianni because he does a particular thing and we both need it. I'm working with someone in Derby at the moment who does various things for me as and when, and working with, you know, 3 or 4 people locally. And, you know, the reality is that, you know, they all give each other and other people and me and people things they have. And I think it isn't the gig economy. It's developing your sense of being a free creative agent where you have certain skills and you can be in the world on your terms. And I think telling people what you can do and why they need you is more important than taking any job that, you know, anyone could offer you. You know, I'm sure there are worthwhile part 1, part 2 jobs to have, but your free thinking skills as a resilient architectural agent that can operate in any context are much more valuable to yourself and to people who might want to use your skills.
And some of the most interesting practices came out of the last recession, I would say.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah, I think that I would agree. I think that at times like this, you know, the temptation is to sort of, you know, jump into something and think, oh God, you know, I've got to protect myself. And obviously for some people economically, there will be holes that have to be filled. I think that, you know, in terms of thinking about a longer term and how in the longer term we may be able to change our economy and our means of production is very important, because we have a very short-term service-driven economy at the moment, and actually the resilience of architecture is quite short-term as well, you know, in terms of it relies a lot, and it gets impacted on financial crashes because people get jumpy, they pull money out. So I think what, as students, you need to be thinking, and actually as a practitioner, I equally think, and as an educator, I'm constantly having to critically think and reevaluate what are things that you can have in a longer term, in a shorter term. And so I think the range of skills that Piers and Lee were talking about, I mean, you're very well positioned as architects, because we're trained to think through a variety of different sources and means. And I think thinking laterally at this point is what is going to be our saviour, you know, and trying to reimagine and react on actually what else can we do as architects. And yes, there are immediate things that you all probably have very good, you know, digital skills, you might have good physical skills elsewhere. And those are things that you may be able to earn some money from. You may be good gardeners, you know, you may be good other builders. You may actually want to learn new skills right now, so that, you know, in the long term, you can both practice as a designer, an architect, but also a farmer. You know, I think at this point, it's a good time to sort of think about the diversity in the long term in relationship to the whole cycle.
Completely. I mean, we're developing a master's unit at the moment for next September, and that is really the agenda of our master's unit, is how do we create the circumstances within which we can work. So what is it what is it that we do when we go into a place that helps us understand what it is we need to do? How do we know what we need to change? How do we then, once we've made change, know that we have made change? What is the territory of this change that we need to make? And all of the other things, other than doing the thing that we do very well, which is to make buildings. And Flora Samuel's book, Why Architects Matter, is super interesting, because it talks about, you know, at its most basic, if we are asked to talk about our skills, we drill down into being some kind of taste police. But actually, if we expand up from that and look at all of the extraordinary, complex and sophisticated things that we do as choreographers of people and situations, which are immensely complex, those are super interesting. And I think all of the other stuff around the building, developing all of those things in parallel, are really fantastically exciting, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So we've had quite a few questions come in just while we've been talking. So I'm gonna maybe read 2 or 3 of these out in one go, and then we can kind of take them on, because they overlap slightly as well. So Izzy has asked, can you talk about how you might envisage the kind of structures of institutions and kind of teaching and studying changing and developing? And then Robin again has asked, how do we kind of replace or work within the current format of architectural education? So I think that kind of fits again with Izzy's question. And then also Rachel has asked, to what extent do you think the virus will affect the type of work that is developed in university projects during this period? So I think there's a kind of crossover between all of those. So I don't know if, Max, maybe you want to start on that.
I think that we're going to see a lot more online teaching and a lot more sort of hybrid modes, because again, this issue, we don't know how long this situation will take. Now, obviously, we're going to get through it, and, you know, things will return to some form of normality. However, you know, what this has exposed is the lack of preparedness that society has for something like this, and also that there possibly will be more pandemics in the future as well. So I think the idea of a resilience whereby you can have a sort of hybrid method of how you can work, you know, both online and then physically, I think that's going to be something that does change and is probably quite a seismic shift actually in architectural education, because, you know, currently we've got a lot of, you know, if you think about the people that are going to come to regular institutions, they are going to decide, am I going to book my plane in September now? Well, probably not, because you don't know what's going to happen. So, you know, universities are in crisis mode. They're having to rethink their very nature and their very core and their structure. And I think this has rocked them quite significantly, because a lot of universities have probably financially invested beyond their means, and, you know, got to a position whereby they rely so heavily upon, you know, various cohorts of students from around the globe, that they will have to rethink, you know, the very nature and the very matter of what they are. So I guess that's, I probably won't touch on the other questions, but that touches on one of the first one.
Yeah. Lee, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, we managed to move quite quickly within the space of a week from being a physical institution to being an online institution. But at the same time, one thing that's been interesting for me in the role I now have, which is running a course, is that as well as trying to, you know, provide a really, really amazing architectural education for young people, I'm also told to make money. I'm told to recruit. I'm told to market. My job, and actually the jobs of the staff around me, and the experience and the resources that the students have available to them, then end up being kind of dumped in some ways on my shoulders by, you know, so, you know, if I don't get enough numbers in, if we don't retain enough people, if we don't keep people for long enough, then someone, you know, who gets paid more money than me is kind of keeping an eye on that, and will kind of hit me with a stick if I'm not performing. And so that has been a kind of really horrific way in which higher education has kind of moved, you know, even since I started in like 20 years ago, to a very market-driven situation, where as civic institutions, it's not the kind of way I see it as a kind of like local civic institution where people from disadvantaged backgrounds in Preston and Blackpool and Burnley and Bolton and the northwest of England have a way of kind of gaining knowledge and advancing their own kind of situation in interesting ways. It's a business that you pay to access, and hopefully this starts to kind of pull at that a little bit, you know. So, you know, as the institution, as a physical thing and as a financial entity and as a business, is going to have to now really think seriously about how people can connect with it and identify with it, and not as a financial transaction, but as something far more meaningful, because we're about to prove that, you know, 75% of what those institutions were flogging for the money wasn't ever needed. And so that, you know, maybe is going to be quite terrifying. Like even myself, my narrative to students looking around the Grenfell Baines Institute of Architecture thinking about whether to apply was, oh, well, we have small numbers. I don't have more than 45 in a year. You'll all get a desk. You'll all get a drawing board. You'll all get access to all these amazing workshop facilities without having to book a session. And now all of that's, you know, kind of, it ain't there anymore, you know. So it's like, what's the, you know, what is it? You know, I'm having a kind of, you know, rethink what is important and what I offer. And actually, is it about people? Is it about being able to say, well, actually, people, you know, kids from Preston and Northwest now, let's connect them to a unit down in Brighton. You know, I've got third years who are looking at Blackpool as a project, looking critically at pleasure, production, poverty. And all of a sudden now I feel more, I don't know, more confident in maybe approaching other institutions or other schools of architecture or other practitioners to say, oh, are you looking at this as well? You know, let's kind of share that. Let's team up on that. Let's pair some of our students with some of your students and kind of reimagine and take advantage of, you know, the fact that we're looking at similar things in similar ways, but previously have felt detached by the confinement of an institution and its own identity and its own business model and its own agenda.
Do you think it's like it's broken down boundaries because we're all leveled, we're all sat in our living room, at our dining table, in the kitchen, in our bedroom, and so what, like, there's a kind of level playing field now. It's like, and nobody's got a workshop, nobody's like got kind of these kind of spaces. It's all working from home. So do you think that's changed that landscape slightly?
A little bit. I mean, what's been interesting for me, I mean, we have quite a lot of students who, come from, kind of definitely backgrounds of no privilege at all. And so one of my tasks over the last week has been making sure that UCLAN's going to buy some laptops, buy some Wi-Fi dongles, that they're going to make that accessible. I've got students who are sitting in a room, actually, I've got a student who is having to go back to Liverpool and lives in a house with 10 other family members, and they don't have internet access and a laptop shit, so like that. So for some people, I think it is leveling, but then for a kind of minority within that group, it's actually a time of extreme anxiety, and that's one way, I suppose, being part of an institution can help, because at the moment I can call on people to collectively provide those resources and ship them and send them, or make them available to be collected or whatever.
But they're artificial again, aren't they? I mean, I think what's really interesting about institutions is that they're an artificial thing, and societally, they don't work either. In that, a school having stuff that is used from 9 till 3 in one context 5 days a week that other people can't use outside that is kind of madness. There's a sports hall that's not used, that kind of stuff. I mean, I think at best, there's Robert's Global Free Unit has this idea where you design your own educational syllabus, and you go around places to choose the course that you want to do, that can range from 3 days to 3 months, and you get credits for that wherever that is. And part of the problem is that institutions don't speak to one another. But if institutions were able to offer a variety of more flexible educational models, so I could go to UCLan for 3 days, 3 months to do something with Lee, and then I could get some credits for that, and then I could go and do something with Max, and I could get some credits for that, and ultimately build up a kind of an educational portfolio. I think it would be really, really interesting. So in a way, you still keep the institution, but they're just a much more flexible series of short and longer term sort of infrastructural things that are available, I think. And I think that if we expand that, as I started talking, to this sense of society, I mean, we've been looking here at how do we make a series of making spaces that we can use, but also how do we allow local schools to use them, local people to use them, whoever else wants to come and use these things, because we're only going to use them, however many hours a week. And I think, the more we can in society be able to collaborate with other people, other institutions, other places, it has to be a good thing.
Yeah, definitely.
But it's too early to tell. I mean, you're asking as if it's already changed, Laura. I think nothing's changed yet, whereas everything needs to be able to be more adaptive so we can react very quickly.
Yeah, well, I guess, we're only like a week into something that has kind of caused a fundamental shift in society and the way things work. And one thing that I've definitely noticed is like, it almost feels like snow day at school or something, and everyone's a bit like excited, and like everyone's using like this virtual technology, and everyone's like, oh, I can talk on my computer, oh, look at this. But like, maybe a couple of weeks down the line, we're all going to be pretty sick of video calls. We're all going to be like, when can I get back in the office? I think like that shift, we're still in the kind of like romantic honeymoon period, as much as it's like anxious and like horrible, and we're all just like, ugh. At the same time, it's not really like a kind of a drag yet, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it might inspire a re-emergence of a legal rave culture when everyone does get fed up and then agrees to go into the hills and have raves, but still stay 2 meters apart at the same time while they're dancing or something like that. Yeah. And, I'm kind of waiting for the COVID subculture to emerge. That's what I'm kind of interested in.
Yeah. On that note, I might actually draw us to a close, because I realise we have gone kind of quite over time, and I'm sure like everyone else has maybe got things that they've got to go and do. But I would just like to kind of say thanks so much to Max and to Piers and Lee for kind of coming and agreeing to be part of this. And thanks to everyone who kind of signed in and listened for a bit or for all of it. If you do have feedback on kind of how you think it worked, or or if there's any other kind of topics or things that you want to pick up in future ones, then I'm planning to try and run these like once a week for the kind of future. I don't know how long for, or yeah. So kind of, yeah, drop me an email and let me know. But yeah, thanks everyone. Guys, do you want to add anything as we kind of finish? Or
I think in terms of a forum, I mean, I think theming it is a really good idea, so that people can come to a place where their concern, even if they don't have time to speak, their concern is part of a family of concerns that fits within, you know, the theme of that day or week or something, is a really good idea, actually. But I think the more of this type of thinking about, I mean, I think my simple thing is that out of crises come change, you know, for the better. And I think that, you know, when things I remember I got really ill once with swine flu, and I was like, shit, I just want my old life back. When am I going to get better? When am I going to get better? Then I realized I didn't want my old life back. You know, I wanted to leave that life and have a new life. And I think that part of this is a reflection on just how shit things were in this extraordinarily kind of, you know, sort of binary model of work and life, a binary model of living and studying, a binary model of having to get a part 1 and get a job, to get a part 2, to get a job, to get a part 3. All that can change for the better, I think.
yeah. Max, Lee, do you want to add anything before we all say?
I think that this has been, you know, a great forum. It's great to actually kind of, you know, see so many faces, to meet people. I mean, I've met Lee in person in Venice before. I just meeting Piers digitally now, and I can see Duncan there, so hi Duncan. And to meet so many kind of new people in this way, I think it's really nice. It's really refreshing. And I think there are hundreds of opportunities. I think this is a very exciting time, and I think we all have to be incredibly positive, and, you know, make a change. We need a change. I mean, it is quite clear we need to change our society, and we need to change our world. So let's hope that this is the starting point for that.
Yeah, great.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Laura, for organising.
Thank
You
you.
can go get dressed now, Lee.
Sorry?
Lee can go get dressed now.
I know, yeah, I can go and put some, I can put my bottom half back on. Yeah. I mean, I think each week it'll be interesting to see how things change, you know, and how the situation has changed, and whether what we've spoken about today is going to be, you know, still relevant in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, or whether we will have all kind of become stir crazy and kind of, yeah, I think being able to have a forum where we kind of keep track of that and talk about it's really useful.
Great. Well, I hope you all kind of join us for future weeks. I'll post it online in the kind of same way that I did this one. So just, yeah, keep an eye out for that. But thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Bye.